Thanks again, Dr. McCleary-Sills, for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Dennis. I'd like to take a minute to tell you all a little bit about my institution. I could see from the RSVP list that some of you might not already be familiar with ICRW and with our work. So as Dennis said, I'm the Director for Gender Violence and Rights at the International Center for Research on Women, that's ICRW. And ICRW is about to turn 40, so we're very excited that next year will be 40th anniversary and really doing quite a lot to revisit everything that we've done in the past 40 years. And our focus is on using rigorous research to inform evidence-based action that promotes gender equality, and we do this work all over the globe. Child marriage is one of our flagship issues, and it has been for more than 20 years, as have other forms of gender-based violence, girls' education, women's economic empowerment, and a host of other relevant issues for the dialogue on gender equality in the global space. Linked to all of this work is a focus on gendered social norms, and that's a lot what I'll be talking about today, is this the issue of how gendered social norms affect girls' risk of experiencing child marriage, how it also affects their educational outcomes and opportunities, and then, of course, how these two are inextricably linked. So the big picture of where this emerged from, it was undertaken as part of a set of other work that I and colleagues were doing while at the World Bank. The paper that Dennis mentioned, which will be released soon in the Review on Faith and International Affairs, was conducted by a number of co-authors who were at the World Bank Group at the time of the writing, and one of them is on the call today, Jennifer Parsons, so she'll also be available to answer questions when we get to that part of the call. But when we started to do the work, we were really interested in girls' and women's agency and the overlapping deprivations that they encounter in trying to exercise their agency in a number of domains. We did not have an intentional focus on faith when we began these analyses, but as you'll hear through the course of the conversation today, that sort of emerged organically when it became clear that a lot of the challenges might be derived from faith or traditional practices, and that luckily a lot of the solutions too also draw very much on faith and on faith leaders. So while it wasn't an intentional focus of our early stage of the work, it's something that we've been able to add in a little bit later as our analyses evolved and as our conversation developed. So to take another big step back, I want to just talk for a minute about the big picture of child early and forced marriage, which perhaps not all of you are familiar with, but here's what we know. The magnitude of child marriage is pretty staggering. In the developing countries, 1 in 3 girls will be married before the age of 18. That means 142 million girls in the next decade alone, and UNFPA has done some estimates to find that that is about 39,000 girls per day. So again, really staggering numbers, and we're not just talking about this abstract concept of child marriage, but something that is very real, and as Dennis said, has profound consequences on the well-being of the individual young women who experience it, but as we'll talk about, also to their communities, their families, and it really does have intergenerational effects. So we'll talk also a bit about the causes of child marriage. We know from decades of research now that child marriage as a practice is driven by poverty. It's driven by social norms, some of which we'll talk about today, gender inequality being one of them, and the ways that gender inequality is manifest in different cultures and contexts. And in some cases, yes, religious and traditional beliefs can also drive the practice of child marriage. So that's the overall framing. This is why we were so motivated to actually look at child marriage in part of our broader analyses. Now, the paper that will be published in a couple of weeks in the review draws on a number of other sources and some previous analyses that the team and I did. So the first is a book called Voice and Agency, and that's a World Bank publication that we launched last year. It's Voice and Agency, Empowering Women and Girls for Shared Prosperity. And in the 4th chapter, we focus on child marriage, among other issues of women's agency. So for this paper, we drew very heavily on those analyses, and those use demographic and health survey data from more than 50 countries. There are, those 50 countries, I believe it's 54, they represent 78% of the developing world population. So it's just really important to note that while these are national level population representative data, it really does cover the majority of the global south. So for this paper, we, as I said, used voice and agency as a starting point, and we really begin by looking at the definitions of girls' agency and showing how it matters for both education outcomes and for risk of and consequences for child marriage. We then move to a synthesis of what has worked to promote girls' education, meaning keeping them in school, keeping them through their, ideally, into secondary years and to secondary school completion, and also what has worked to prevent early marriage, child marriage. And for that, we drew on 27 impact evaluations that were funded by the World Bank Group, as well as some other literature that my co-authors and I were familiar with, and that seems to get a lot of good coverage as being some of the most promising practices that we're familiar with. So we drew on this very large set of data and evidence, as I said, more than 50 countries and then 27 different impact evaluations. And I'll spend a little bit of time just talking through what the overriding findings were then. I will, for the time being, skip the agency framing, though I'm certainly happy to talk about that later if there are some specific questions. But again, the book Voice and Agency lays that all out very clearly. The overarching finding as it comes to agency, though, is that education, especially secondary level education, significantly reduces women's risk of experiencing any of the agency deprivations that we explored. And nowhere was this more salient than when we looked at child marriage. So I talked a bit before about the global picture and the prevalence and magnitude of child marriage, but now we need to start talking about really why it happens and who's most at risk. So our analyses in Voice and Agency, some of which we also present in this paper, they show us a little bit more of the detail of this risk. Our analyses show that 1 in 2 girls among the 50-plus countries that we looked at were married before the age of 18. It was just over 51%. We saw that girls in poor households were twice as likely to marry before the age of 18 compared with girls in wealthier households. And we're not talking about the wealthiest necessarily, but just as a comparative, in the poor households, you had double the risk of marrying before the age of 18. And the same was true when we compared girls living in rural areas to girls living in urban areas. It was about double the risk. We did not have any relevant findings linking religion to child marriage. So in our sample, looking just at child marriage, we were able to blow that up a bit more and include 111 countries. And there's a figure that you can look at in Voice and Agency, but it shows you the prevalence figures across those 111 countries. And again, it shows you quite a lot more regional variation and unfortunately a lot higher prevalence than many people know in parts of the world that are not typically associated with child marriage. But these countries include those that are Christian majority, some that are Muslim majority, some that are Hindu and Buddhist majority. And what we see is that really no clear patterns emerge based on the majority religion in a given country. While there were no clear religious lines, we do know from lots of other studies that religion and culture are often used to justify child marriage, and this is true across countries and regions, and sometimes it's hard to disentangle when we're talking specifically about a religious dictate or practice and where it is just taken on as cultural, and perhaps religion is used as an excuse to help justify it. As we again looked at the overarching patterns to see where the risk was greatest, we were able to pull from some other sources that looked at regional rates. And they were highest in sub-Saharan Africa. They were relatively low in Latin America. We're talking about 21% and 17%. And they were also quite low in Eastern and Southern Europe. So we're looking at the single digits here, about 8%. And so it's useful for us to have these aggregate numbers to talk about the comparison, right? Where's the greatest risk? But the challenge with it then is that looking at the regional level really does mask a lot of hot spots. It hides the variation within regions and within countries. And so, if you look at some of the other figures, you'll see 75% prevalence of child marriage in a country like Bangladesh, 74% in some of the Central African countries. But when we aggregate them up, some of those very high levels disappear. And so just an important note to keep in mind that, we're looking at regional levels, but it doesn't give us the full picture and all of the nuance that we might want. We also saw other risks related directly to education. So girls who had no education are up to 6 times more likely to marry young, meaning before 18, than girls who have a secondary education. So that's an enormous difference. We also saw that the longer a girl stays in school, the less likely she is to be married before 18 and to have children during her teenage years. So obviously looking at these outcomes, we see that they're very clearly linked. You could be married you could have a child without being married, but that could also affect your ability to stay in school, either because schools kick you out for having an early pregnancy or family responsibilities mean that you're no longer able to juggle both. You could also be married and have to leave school, and that's a pattern that we see quite a lot, or not be prioritized to go to school and then end up getting married before 18. So these are all very, very much linked, and we often look at them together to really understand what these patterns are. We also looked at some other domains of agency, namely the ability to refuse sex, and this is within marriage, right? A lot of the countries that we have data for, we're only able to look at married women or women who are in union of some kind. So they're, for all intents and purposes, they're considered married. But with their husbands and partners, did they feel like they were able to refuse sex if they didn't want to have it? And among girls who were married after age 18, they're significantly more likely to feel like they have some control in that domain of their lives. And this likelihood increases with each year that marriage is delayed beyond the age of 18. So an 18-year-old has less control over refusing sex than someone who is married at 19, and again, compared to someone who is married at 20 and so forth. So we do see an increasing and incremental protective factor for each year that marriage is delayed past 18. Another finding that is really important to highlight is that being married early is associated with a 20% higher probability of experiencing intimate partner violence. So girls who were married before 18 reported much higher rates of physical violence and or sexual violence from their husbands. And that is a dramatic difference then, because we also know that intimate partner violence has a number of effects on mental health, physical health, and overall well-being. So again, we see that cycle repeating. At a more macro level, we know that where child marriage is high, there are high rates of infant mortality. We also know there are high rates of maternal mortality and high fertility. So we see that an individual risk of child marriage really does lead not just to challenges and problems for the individual girl who experiences it, but really at the national level, it's sort of an unfortunate trickle-up effect. Which makes it a really critical issue for us as a development community. It does affect all domains of development, as I've touched on some of them, and just the exercise of fundamental human rights, the right to live free from violence, the right to have some say over your sexual health and your reproduction. It affects your access to employment, your mobility, child nutrition for that next generation, and the family well-being. We also see that there's a deeply symbiotic relationship here. To prevent child marriage, we have to keep girls in school. And to keep girls in school, we have to prevent child marriage. So how do we do that? And that's the next part of the paper that really digs into what the impact evaluations that we had available to us say, and what the broader literature actually has to teach us about how to prevent these two things, or rather promote girls' secondary school completion and also prevent child marriage. So a lot of things have been tried, some things have been tested and shown to be fairly effective, and I'll focus on those that have shown to be effective in promoting gender equality in education. Again, looking at girls' enrollment being on par with boys, their completion rates being on par with that of boys, and ideally having the quality of education be quite high, but those findings are a little bit less directly linked here. So we've seen that scholarships and cash transfers, hiring more female teachers, reducing the distance to schools, and generally making schools safer are all good for promoting gender equality in education. From the safety perspective, we see innovations and improvements being made to toilets and latrines and other hygiene options within the school, to lighting in and around the school, also providing gender sensitivity training for teachers, making revisions to the curricula, and developing and making sure that teachers adhere to codes of conduct. And that is one way to help prevent any sexual violence against girls and boys within schools. We've seen a lot of different opportunities exploring cash transfers, both conditional and unconditional cash transfers, and they show varying levels of success. And one of the things that we see them doing is some give the money, the cash transfer directly to the student, the girl, and some give them to her parents, and some provide it to perhaps another family member. And that's one of the variables that's really interesting to look at how the results differ. What we've seen from the analysis that we provided in this paper is that the best approach, the most effective approach, really is a combination. So it takes that cash transfer, particularly the cash transfers that go to girls, which are the most effective, and it combines them with other programmatic components, such as some of the ones that I mentioned above. So it's that linked, multi-dimensional program that is going to have the greatest impact on keeping girls in school. There's an example from India that ICRW actually is doing the impact evaluation of. Still, it's ongoing, but it is a conditional cash transfer for poor families, and families enroll when the daughter is born. 18 years later, they're able to cash in if the daughter is still in school and not married by the time she's turning 18. And the preliminary findings from this show that it did have a positive effect on keeping girls in school and unmarried to 18. One of the other objectives of the program, though, was to change the perceived value of the girl child, and it's unclear whether that has changed. So sort of tapping into the attitudes and the other gendered social norms, it doesn't seem like the needle has moved quite so far on those yet. But the practice, at least, of marrying girls before 18 has dramatically reduced in the communities where they have this conditional cash transfer option. So when we look at the evidence for preventing child marriage, it's very similar to the evidence in education, that effective strategies are multifaceted. They target multiple social and economic drivers of the practice, including the norms that I've referred to, and that they'll also target the individual and family levels and often the community levels. So again, here we see these conditional cash transfers, the CCTs. We see provision of life and vocational skills. We see mentorship for girls and free education, because there's an acknowledgement of this link between education and risk of marriage. And we have a really, I think, a number of fantastic examples of community engagement. One that I'll highlight, and that is highlighted also in our previous work, is Tostan, which is a program in Senegal. And it really, it draws very heavily on community engagement models and uses a very participatory approach to bring in the local leaders, including religious leaders, and to get them to sponsor, in many ways, changes in these in long practice cultural norms, specifically looking at the practice of child marriage and also female genital cutting. And what's key about the Tostan example, again, being truly participatory and locally grounded, they didn't use the word female genital mutilation. They said cutting because that's how it was called locally. And I think that, in there are a lot of important lessons, but also that they counted on the religious leaders who are the gatekeepers and who are often the holders of the local norms and morals, and are looked upon to set the tone and tell others in the community what's acceptable. So that's another great example that we've seen. And again, they used a very community-based approach, and they also had multiple prongs through which they were doing this action. So that's a kind of a 1,000-foot view of what we found that really looks to prevent child marriage and promote girls' education. We've learned a lot over the last couple of decades, really, and we've highlighted some of this in our paper about what works to address the social norms that perpetuate child marriage and also that perpetuate girls' inequality in education. We've also learned a lot about how inextricably linked the two are. And as we move forward, these conclusions need to be applied with more solutions tested, more innovations tried, because we know that just because an intervention works in one community doesn't mean that it will work in another. So we have to think through what are the elements that make these successful, and how can we take those lessons and apply them elsewhere, and of course, then scale them up. While we haven't addressed it in detail here in the paper, we also do highlight, though, that preventing child marriage, while we have some lessons from the things I've just presented, it also requires strengthened legal and policy frameworks. And this is a way that we can ensure there's awareness about the laws and greater enforcement of the laws. We know that in so many countries where child marriage is prevalent, there are actually laws that say that it is not a legal practice, that the legal age of marriage is 18, but yet the practice persists. So we have to focus on strengthening what is on paper, but then also really improving the enforcement of those laws. And just in closing, I would say that something for us at ICRW and for my colleagues and co-authors, our focus on child marriage is as a critical development issue. We know that as long as it continues unchecked, as long as the current trends remain, we're not going to reach the global development goals of universal education, gender equality in education. And we're at this moment now in 2015 where we're about to enter into force these new sustainable development goals. And in there is a standalone goal. Certainly we have the education goal, but we also have a new focus on ending violence against women in all its forms, and that includes child marriage. So this is an opportunity for us to really renew our focus, to get re-energized and pull together and say, these are the lessons that we've got. Let's apply them, and let's actually put this practice of child marriage to end for once and for all, and let's promote gender equality in education, and let's do that in a concerted way so that we can actually reach our development goals. So I will stop there, and I look forward to hearing your questions and engaging with you on these topics.
Great. Many thanks, Jennifer. Fantastic. You've given us a lot to chew on, and I'm sure our callers are eager to engage with you on these issues more. So we'll now open the lines for questions from the audience. As a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question and you're not already in the queue, please press 5*. And when it's your turn to ask a question, today's call administrator, Lindsay Kunz, will announce your name and unmute your line so that you may ask it. Your line will be placed back on mute immediately following the asking of the question. Also, please note that if you're in the queue and for any reason decide you no longer wish to ask your question, simply press 5* again, and your name will be erased from the queue. And finally, for the sake of all our callers, I'll ask that when you're called upon, please immediately ask your question rather than providing your own commentary. So without further ado, Lindsay, do we have any questions?
Sure. Our first question today was actually emailed in, Jennifer. So I was wondering if you could just address how the structural, social, and financial barriers are defined.
Sure. Okay. Thanks, Lindsay. I didn't say so much about those at the outset, but we do, in the beginning of the paper, talk about when we refer to these gender norms that I've mentioned a few times today, we kind of separate them into a few different categories. We talk about structural barriers and also structural norms. We talk about social and then financial barriers. So when we're talking about structural barriers, again, as we think about barriers to school completion, we're thinking about things like the location of schools. How hard is it for a girl to get to a school? What kind of disrepair is that school in? Is the route from her home to that school safe? Those are some of the big structural barriers that we often hear girls and their families talk about. Social barriers are a lot of the gendered norms that we've talked about, right? So the prioritization of oftentimes boys' education over girls' education, the dual and sometimes triple burden that the girls have in their homes of doing some of the housework and also then being expected to keep up on their schoolwork while their brothers often have only the one job, which is going to school. Also just lower expectations, right, that there's no point in investing in a girl's education if she's going to just be married off. And then the final category of financial barriers, I think, is a little bit more straightforward, but schools aren't always free. And even where there is free, for example, primary or even secondary education, there are often costs related to buying uniforms, buying school supplies, buying textbooks, or transport to school. So these are all barriers that really disproportionately affect girls in the global south and keep them from completing their education.
Great, thank you for that. And then a quick follow-up question. This other participant also emailed in and asked, if there's strong evidence supporting that child marriage has such negative effects, why then do parents still keep marrying their daughters off when they're so young?
Yeah, that's a question we hear a lot, and it's one we've explored and talked with parents about. I think that it is, unfortunately, it's quite easy to kind of blame parents and say, well, if they knew it was bad, they should just stop doing it. But the fact is, so many parents marry their girls off early because it's actually seen as the best option for her. It is the safest option for her. It gives her a stable future. Again, we're talking about this as a practice in context where womanhood is defined as being married and being a mother, and so this secures her future in some way. It's also a way for the family to make sure she's provided for, that the family is perhaps overburdened and stretched thin on their finances, providing for a large number of children. Marrying your daughter off gets her into a safe place, so they think, where she's able to prosper and in some ways, be the head of household. Unfortunately, what we see, though, is that girls who are married young, as I mentioned, they tend to be among the poorer girls who are at greatest risk for marrying young, but also that getting married young perpetuates that cycle of poverty. So you're much more likely to be poor and stay poor if you're married early. So parents do have the best intentions, but the reality is that it doesn't actually protect their daughters in many of the ways that they want. And we're seeing this. We're seeing a spike in this. There's at least anecdotal evidence that in refugee contexts or in context of displacement, child marriage is starting to spike again in populations where it wasn't previously so prevalent. Again, because of the sense of safety. Right, the daughter will be in a safer place if we can get her married.
Thank you for that. All right, our next question comes from Mr. Galen Carey. All right, so Galen, your line has been unmuted, so go ahead and ask your question, please.
Yes, hi. So I'm interested in the conditional cash transfer for girls who don't get married, and I wonder if there's any indications of whether that leads to prolonged singleness or just to cohabitation on the part of the girls.
That's a good question. I'll answer the first part of it, but then as I mentioned, my co-author, Jennifer Parsons, is on the call, so I will ask Lindsay to pass it on to her to respond to the second part. One of the examples that I gave, though, was from India, this ABAD program, where the conditional cash transfer, as I mentioned, has shown some success in keeping girls unmarried and in school until 18. There's not, at least in a lot of the rural areas where this is being implemented in Haryana, India, there's not much of a culture of dating. So the risk of being cohabitating and how that might be perceived by the community, I think is quite low. To singleness, I think what we've seen, at least in the preliminary analysis so far, is that actually girls are getting married at 18. Or at 19. So they are completing school, and they are then promptly cashing in, getting the cash infusion and using that as a dowry. So that's being used as the bride price, so to speak. And I think that's where some of the concern is coming up. When I mentioned that the goal of the program was to keep girls in school, keep them unmarried, and change the perceived value of the girl, that's the last piece of it, where the hope was the parents would see how wonderful it was to have an educated daughter and then give her the sort of space to continue her studies, pursue, tertiary education perhaps, but it doesn't appear to be happening that way. So they're getting to 18 unmarried and in school, but then quickly soon after they're getting married. But we do have some examples from some of the other studies that were included in our analysis, and perhaps, Jen, if you wanted to answer some of those specific findings, that would be great.
Yeah, and I think the question, I think, about the prolonged singleness is one that wasn't necessarily, in some of the evaluations that we looked at, wasn't necessarily explored. I think that probably the most interesting, or a relevant finding from the cash transfer programs was in a number of the programs that we looked at, it was not in and of itself just the cash transfer, but it was these additional educational components that really seem to be effective and lead to the best outcomes in terms of both keeping girls in school and delaying marriage. There was a talk of programs that have included girls' clubs, vocational and life skill courses, providing mentors and recreational activities as a part of the intervention, in addition to subsidies for school uniforms and school supplies, and also looking at actually the curriculum and the infrastructure of the schools where the girls were attending and making sure that those were up to par, and really kind of all of those things together in addition to just the cash transfer that were the most effective. So I think that's important to note, is that it's not just the cash transfer. It's the additional components as well.
Yep. Thanks for that, Jen.
Mm-hmm.
Another point is just to say the example I gave from India, the condition can't be met for 18 years. A lot of the other conditional and unconditional cash transfer programs, the outcomes are measured much more frequently and a bit earlier. Some of the other CCT programs, again, conditions, they have the condition based on attendance. So if you have, for example, an 80% attendance record, you will get the cash transfer, or in other cases, your parents will get the transfer. So the payout, so to speak, comes much earlier, and they do show kind of varying levels of success. One of the studies that we looked at also showed that some of these the programs would increase enrollment for younger girls, but not for older girls. And there was one particular study from Bangladesh where there is the labor market supply, or the labor market had such a high demand for factory workers that older girls were actually going to school just long enough to get the skills they needed, or the literacy levels that they needed to then get a factory job. So girls were enrolling, but they were not completing because they had this other, in many ways, more powerful draw than education.
Great. Thanks to both of you for that. I'm going to invoke my moderator's privilege here and ask a question of my own, but also encourage the callers as well to not be shy and get in the queue with your questions while we have actually two experts on the line on this incredible topic. But my own question is, how can we more effectively share these kinds of findings with religious leaders to kind of educate and encourage their active involvement and advocacy in this issue?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Dennis. It's something that I think both of our institutions, I failed to mention earlier that while Jennifer and I, both Jennifers, we were at the World Bank Group doing this research. I am now at ICRW, and Jennifer is at American Jewish World Service. So our institutions do quite a lot of policy engagement and advocacy, and particularly on these issues. For ICRW's part, we have not done so much direct engagement with religious leaders, and I think it's an area that we really need to work on more, particularly for issues around child marriage and some of these deeply entrenched cultural practices. But one of the ways that we have found effective really is that it not becoming just from us. It's about finding a champion within that community who can then be the messenger. It's just a lot more effective, and this is, it's a lesson that I've learned from some of my previous work. For example, living in the Middle East, and we were trying to encourage family planning and optimal birth spacing, and we could go and talk to a bunch of imams about it, but it wasn't effective. When we found a few imams who were willing to champion that cause and go back to their communities and to their congregations and talk about it, we saw dramatic changes quite quickly. And so I think that's, it's a practice that we as a global community are trying to figure out the best pathway, but it really, it requires having good partnerships and having trusted champions who can take the message and they sort of get the science behind it and they understand the implications of it, and then they're willing to go back to their communities and share it. I will say that I've heard from some, and again, a lot of my experience has been in the MENA region, so I've worked with a lot of imams on this, who say that they end up being blackballed in some ways because they are coming with these progressive, perhaps American-influenced ideas. And so we as a global community trying to encourage these issues and this dialogue, need to also be conscious that it can have an effect on the lives of those champions and those gatekeepers that we're trying to engage.
All right, thanks. And I think Jennifer Parsons, you might have had a question or maybe a comment to add.
Yeah, I was just going to add specifically to the question Dennis asked on the religious leaders. We work with primarily our work is focused in India, and we work with a lot of community-based organizations on the ground in some of the areas with the most high of child marriage in India. And one of those amazing partners that we have is a group called Vikalp, and they came and we've worked with them all the time in terms of trying to figure out what is working on the ground in India and how we can use what they're learning and what they're doing and the results that they're seeing to sort of affect and impact our advocacy here in the U.S. and globally. And one of the, anecdotes that we've heard from their programming specifically is that working with religious leaders in the community, not only religious leaders, but also other folks who are influential, mothers, fathers. They work with a lot of people who are sort of in the wedding planning industry in India, because it is, it's such a lucrative, industry to be in, and they work with a lot of the folks involved actually in the ceremonies, in the wedding planning, to try to prevent child marriage, and really engaging, like Jennifer said, the community leaders and finding sort of volunteers and identifying people within the community that can then reverberate that message to other people. I think whether it's religious leaders or specifically, I think really men and boys within the community, and folks who have sort of that senior position or position of power within a community, no matter what their role, is very important and has proven to be very effective in terms of trying to start to change those norms around early child marriage. So.
Great. Thank you for that added insight, Jennifer. All right. So we have a question here from Kathy Hall. Kathy, your line's been unmuted, so go ahead and ask your question, please. Kathy?
Sorry, yes. I did have a question. I wanted to ask the speakers whether they could speak to anything that you all have been learning about age of sexual debut for girls, and sort of recognizing the fact that we want to be cognizant that it's absolutely critical to delay age of marriage for the many reasons that you all have been outlining. We also want to make sure that a first sexual experience is consensual, which in many cases it's not, whether it's within or outside of marriage. But assuming we can have a consensual first sexual experience, accepting that sexual experience may be, and in fact it's natural for it to be outside of marriage if she's going to be marrying 18 or later. But that can be such a difficult thing to get religious leaders to accept, is that it's normal, from a sexual development standpoint, for that to happen. And I think, Jennifer, you referred to, the fact that there can be sort of an absence of a dating culture. And that, frankly, really does need to be confronted and understood better, and just, some sense of accepting that we want to enable a healthy sexual debut, and also that, of course, the girls can prevent sexually transmitted infections and pregnancy when they are wanting to delay that because they are trying to continue their education and think about their future. So I wonder if you could comment a little bit about how that's being confronted and what the data is showing around that. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Kathy. And hi, Kathy. I know that Jennifer Parsons will want to chime in on this as well, because she also has quite a lot of thoughts to offer on the sexuality piece. I would just say to start that I completely agree. This is an issue that needs to be taken very seriously. When I mentioned that there was an absence of dating culture, I was really specifically thinking of the particular context of this cash transfer program and the evaluation. But it's a challenge that we have in the conversations around child marriage, because they're not always formal marriages. They might be somewhat less formal unions, and that's one subset of where the sexual risk and sexual activity comes. But as you've said, for large swaths of the world, that first sexual experience, assuming that we're talking about consensual sex for the moment, is very much, it's consensual, it's all by choice, but it is not within a stable partnership. It's dating. And this is a challenge that we've had here in the United States, and I think we've learned very clearly that abstinence-only education, and assuming that if you just tell people to wait until marriage and don't give them any of the tools to protect themselves from pregnancy or sexually transmitted infections, that it would all be fine. We've learned that doesn't work. It isn't effective, and it doesn't give young people the skills that they need to make informed choices for themselves and to act on those. And it really deprives them of their agency to protect their own sexual and reproductive rights and interests. What we've seen in some of our other work, and we don't really touch on it here, Although, sorry, we do have we have highlighted a little bit of findings from some of these multi-sectoral programs that in their life skills curricula are also talking about broadly SRH skills and negotiating safe sex and a little bit of sort of body awareness. And that those, of course, do have an effect. But we run into the same problem as we do with a lot of our girls' empowerment or youth empowerment programs. If these young people, and in this case, the young women, are getting this new information and being encouraged to be empowered and to, have safe, responsible, consensual sex before marriage or outside of marriage, they're not being supported by their communities, and so they actually get stigmatized and have quite a lot of social backlash, which then affects them and their families. So it's a bit of this balance in saying the same in all of our work on, for example, violence against women, where you want to empower the women not to put up with violence anymore and teach them about their rights, but it can lead to backlash. And so we just have to be, I think, careful in our approach to make sure that we are providing that through, again, these trusted partners and getting the right folks on board so that the backlash is minimal. But Jen, did you want to add? I know this is a question in particular that you mentioned you would want to respond to.
Yeah, I think this is specifically in India. We have been taking a look at sort of adolescent sexuality and what that looks like and what it means and how to address, in the context of early child marriage, how to address sexuality, given that it is sort of this, elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about, except clearly some of the folks on this call, which is great. So I think that, looking at India, we've got the median age of marriage for girls is 17.2. So what we have sort of started to think about and talk to many of our partners in India about is, they're telling us that, it's adolescents, or they want, both girls and boys are in a position where they want to get married because it's the only way that they can have sex where it's sanctioned by their community. And in terms of specifically adolescent girls, there's very much this anxiety in their family around girl sexuality, and we know that it's one of the root causes driving child marriage. And this is something that is sort of just starting to be explored, I think, within the context of social norms, because a lot of times you have parents who, marriage prospects are on the horizon, and so taking it back to girls' education, they may sort of approach girls' secondary education and secondary schooling without much enthusiasm, really questioning, is it worth it if in the long term she's just going to get married? And so not only is their performance maybe suffering as a consequence of this ambivalence within their own household, but then once their marriage is sort of arranged or secured, sometimes, that's when we see a girl being taken directly out of school. So it's really interesting, I think, to explore this connection between managing girls' sexuality in their lives and this strategy of marrying them early that I think Jennifer talked about and is touched on in a lot of literature in terms of protecting them from unapproved sexual relationships, whether it's consensual or not, really undermining this, education is really the most important investment in a girl's future. So I think that there is a very interesting conversation to be had between the context of and the connection between adolescent sexuality and education and child marriage. So I think it's a great question, and thanks for bringing that up.
All right. Well, thanks to both Jennifers for your responses. We have another question from Laura Stolzman. So, Laura, your line has been unmuted, and you can feel free to ask your question. Laura, are you there?
Hi. Sorry about that. Thank you so much. My question is about the increase in child marriages in refugee communities and in emergencies. You mentioned in communities where there was not as high of a prevalence as before the crisis. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts on the factors contributing to this and maybe ideas in terms of policy or work on the ground that could help alleviate it.
Sure. Thanks for that question. As I mentioned, a lot of the evidence that we have of that trend is unfortunately pretty anecdotal at this point, which I say unfortunately because it's often problematic to get policy response or to get a change in programming without so-called hard evidence. So I think it's been problematic for many of us that work in this community. To your first question about why we're seeing those increases, I think that it is linked to more broadly what the drivers and risk factors are for child marriage. So if we know that poverty is one of the main reasons that parents choose to marry their daughters early, and that poor girls are at the greatest risk, well, in a situation of displacement or in a refugee context, your entire social fabric has been eroded. It's been disrupted. And many times the livelihood options for the parents are very different. So even what might have been a comfortable or middle-class family now living in a refugee situation doesn't have the same kind of financial stability that they once did. And that's even in times of peace or in more stable times, it is one of the driving factors for child marriage. So we see that the options in camps, parents are choosing because of their own financial straits, and also because it's not a situation in which you really want to raise children. If you feel like your daughter might get a better life either with a perhaps wealthier family in the camp, or for many, a better option would be someone from the host community, right? So if you are let's say, Syrian refugee in Lebanon and a Lebanese man wants to marry your daughter, that might seem like a much better option for her. So I think that's a large part of the reason why we're seeing that trend. In terms of policies, it's, as I said, very challenging because we don't have the data that we can bring to policymakers and say, look, there's something that you can do. There are some efforts ongoing within communities within refugee and camp communities to tell parents that there are these dangers and to, sort of share stories about girls whose parents thought they were doing the best thing for her, but it turns out that she was actually not being married, but being sold into some sort of sexual slavery. So the cautionary tales are starting to then filter through the communities, and that in some cases might be effective. On the policy level, though, it really requires that those who are administering these camps and managing them have some monitoring in place, which it's also very difficult in these situations of displacement because the girl may not have any identification. So how do you monitor child marriage if you can't prove that she's only 14? So I don't mean for it to sound quite so bleak, but I'd say that as a community we haven't figured out yet how to do that in any formal or structured way within these contexts, but that there are some of these more grassroots efforts, again, the sharing of the cautionary tales, and that a lot of the folks who work in these camps, they're the ones who've picked up on this trend and have started to share it so that we can try to find some solutions.
Thanks much. I think we're just about out of time. I have one final question I'll ask myself. Thinking more about this question of involvement of religious leaders and religious organizations. As you noted, many of them will resist, if not actively oppose, being involved in directly challenging, the existing social norms around sexuality. But they might be more willing to engage in other pro-education kinds of initiatives. And so I was just wondering if there are examples of cases where religious organizations were directly involved in some of these other kinds of interventions that you mentioned before, the ones that have proven to be effective, like cash transfers, safety initiatives, sanitation initiatives. Are those more effective if religious organizations are themselves delivering them?
That's a good question, and I think that we don't, to my knowledge, have any evaluations that ask that question. But we do have some good examples of faith-based organizations implementing programs to address child marriage and also to promote girls' education. One of the other papers, actually, that's going to be included in the special issue of the Review of Faith and International Affairs the one that our paper is going to appear in, does actually include some case studies of programs, including some of the work that World Vision International has done, and a couple of other faith-based initiatives in Kenya, Senegal, India, and Ethiopia. So I think there are some examples out there. We don't, as I said, have a clear answer of whether it's more effective if delivered by an FBO or religious groups compared to others. But we do know that in so many communities where religious leaders are central figures and are gatekeepers, not just for religious reasons, but for social events, and they're the ones who mediate family disputes and who condone or condemn practices like female genital cutting and initiation rites for girls and for boys. Having them involved is critical. So where they have that influence and where they can actually leverage that influence to either perpetuate or change these traditional practices, then they have to be key partners in the development and in these interventions. So there are some, and some of the examples that we highlight also in the paper touch on the importance of that engagement. What we need to do a better job of is, I think this gets to someone's question earlier, is how do you involve them without it being a foreign or Western-led initiative? How do you let it be something that maybe the seed is planted by this international NGO, whether it's an FBO or not, and then let it really be taken up as a grassroots initiative and have the voices of these religious leaders be respected and be as dominant as makes sense. But I do think, Dennis, to another of your points, there's a lot more openness among faith-based communities to address issues like girls' education than issues of gender-based violence, including child marriage. And I think it's an obvious entry point given how linked these two things are, that if we could just get everyone behind the idea of promoting girls' secondary school completion and quality education and safety and all of those things that I mentioned before, if we could all have one concerted effort and a unified voice saying what we need is secondary school completion for girls everywhere, we know that would have an immediate impact then on child marriage rates. So we can kind of push one agenda and get the results of the other without necessarily stepping on some of these sensitivities.
Right. Well, the art and science of planting seeds. Well, thanks so much, Jennifer, for leading us in this really rewarding conversation. We're just about out of time, so we'll close now, and I'll thank you, and I'll thank all the callers who joined us today, and I'll encourage you all to join us on our next Faith and International Affairs conference call, which will be on Thursday, September 24. Our speaker then will be the new president and CEO of the Institute for Global Engagement, John Gallagher. Thank you all again, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.